My name is Robert Haynes. It's the year 2022, and I'm 92 years old, and I've been studying Japanese sword fittings for the last 75 years of my life. And today we're going to discuss my studies in Japan in 1960 with Dr. Kazutaro Torigoye. I became interested in fittings because in my teenage years I was very much interested in European arms and armor, because at that time why there were many films of the medieval period in Europe, and being a romantic I thought that it would be fun to collect the armor of the knights of old, but it was neither available for sale or was I able to have the money to buy it if it was. So I discovered in 1946, when the GIs had brought back tons of material from Japan that they had acquired, that I could concentrate on Japanese arms and armor, and that I could afford, and it was readily available. So I found antique shops in Pasadena, California, where I lived, and I would be able to buy a sword guard for $1. And eventually there was a man called Bernie Craig, who had been collecting for a number of years at that time, and he had a small exhibit of his collection at what they call the Pasadena Art Museum. Anyway, it was a small building that they used for what they thought was an art museum. And I became fascinated when I saw the objects from his collection and was able to find other ones. In later years, I met Bernie and I cataloged his entire collection, which was later sold at Christie's in London. But I then went into the army, was in Korea, and then was in Japan, and was able to buy my first fittings actually in Japan in 1950-51. When I came back, I went to UCLA and was able to buy books, which are still the most important part of collecting for me as far as sword fittings are concerned. My library has stayed with me, where most of the objects that I bought are gone, but I've found over the years that I can learn a great deal by just examining the photographs in the books, and that has kept me interested and able to progress in my studies over the years. But even that, why eventually you have to go farther. There was a gentleman in San Mateo, California called John Yumoto, and John had been trained in Japan even though he was American born, and we got to know each other for a number of years. And one day he came to me and he said, "Bob, how far do you want to go with all of this?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "How far can I go?" And he said, "I can make arrangements for you to study with the leading authority of Japan at this time." I said, "Great, let's do it." So he contacted Dr. Kazutaro Torigoye in Okayama, Japan, made arrangements for me to go to Japan in 1960. And I studied with Dr. T for 9 to 11 months, and at that time, the normal way for Japanese students to study was to come to the teacher once a week for maybe 2 or 3 hours over as many as 20 years or more. So I crammed about 20 years of study into less than a year, because I would have lessons in the morning, in the afternoon, and sometimes in the evening. Dr. Torigoye was a teacher. He taught sociology and English at the Okayama Business College. And so being fluent in English and my not being fluent in Japanese, it worked out very well. And he had just completed his doctoral thesis, which was given to him as a doctoral degree from Kyoto University. And we decided that the easiest way maybe for me to study was simply for him to verbally translate his doctoral thesis book. I would write it in English, and then we would have the whole thing published at a later date. And this was accomplished. It was later made into about a 300-page manuscript, which was not officially published, but it was obtainable through the Northern California Japanese Sword Club. In Okayama, I was the only foreign-born person who was living there at that time, although there were several. There were Mormon missionaries and others. But as far as the person who was daily around on the street, I was the only one who was there. And the city was probably about 200,000 people at that time. It's 500,000 people now or more. But Okayama was a very cultural city. It had many colleges and universities. And the people were very open to a strange foreigner who was studying a very strange subject. But it came to the point where I was able to learn what I would call the basics of the study of fittings. And it stood me well. The information was quite different today from what I learned at that time, which is 60 years ago now. But there were students who came on Tuesday nights. The other students came to study with Dr. Torigoye. There would be 8 or 10 besides myself. And after class, Dr. Torigoye and I would stay on. And he'd say, Bob, he said, some of these people have been coming here to study with me for 20 years, and they don't know any more now than they did when they started 20 years ago. So we became fast friends. In fact, he adopted me into his family, and then later made me his successor as a authority and certifier of fittings. But the atmosphere was very congenial, and his wife, Mrs. Torigoye, was very good to take me around to many collections and exhibits and various areas where I could see large numbers of fittings from private collections, which is very difficult in Japan for most people to be invited. But they were very interested in seeing this crazy foreigner who was studying in Japan, so I had great advantage of being able to see a very large number of collections. As far as I know, I am still the only foreigner who had classical training in Japan, and it afforded me a very good foundation in the study of the fittings and the proper way to approach the study. Now that it is 60 years later from that time, I realize that much of the study that I learned was a good beginning, but unfortunately only a beginning. But without it, and without Dr. Torigoye's help and expertise, I would never have been able to get as far as I do today, and it would be an advantage to any person interested in the study of Japanese sword fittings to find a teacher who could give them a classical education, even though that it may mean that they still would need a great deal of study after that time. But I was very, very lucky, and I appreciate the many, many hours that I was considered a student, but a foreign student, and that is not easy in Japan. But I do understand that I was not a person who was part of the society that I was studying, but I was accepted, and I really appreciate all the time and attention that was given to me. I did not explain the daily studies with Dr. Torigoye. He was still teaching at the college. He taught English and sociology at the business college in Okayama. But when he was not teaching, I would be at his house to take my lessons in sword fittings, and there was usually maybe 2 hours in the morning, then 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon, and that would be for the 5 days of the week. I had purchased notebooks because I was handwriting the translation. Dr. Torigoye was giving it to me verbally. And then when there was need for explanation or additional material, he would write in my notebook. In the beginning, I wasn't sure how we were going to handle the whole thing, but luckily the hotel I lived in, the lady who ran it had a typewriter. So she loaned me the typewriter, and then I started typing the classes I had each day, and then I would take those back to Dr. Torigoye, and then we would add material, because the book as he had written it was written naturally for the Japanese, not for the foreigners. So he had to add a great deal of material to the translation of his own book so that it would be understandable to the foreign student. So by the time that we were, it was 9 months of this, so that by that time, why we had translated the entire book, which was probably 300 pages. And the other advantage I had was that Dr. Torigoye had a very complete personal private collection, what I like to refer to as a one of everything collection, so that he was able then, we would be studying in a particular area, and he was able to take the actual tsuba from his collection and show them to me as we discussed the various schools and artists, so that they could be explained with objects in my hand. The way that most students in Japan they will bring objects to the teacher, and the teacher then will tell them what they are being shown. But you very rarely get to see the private collection of the teacher, and in Japan you cannot ask to go to see a person's collection unless you have some way of getting an introduction, and then they have to decide if they want to have you come or not. So it's very difficult. Being a foreigner, they were as interested in seeing me and wondering why I was studying a subject that they thought was very strange for a foreigner to be interested in. So I was able to visit many, many collections because they thought this crazy American was someone that they were worth having to come and visit just out of curiosity. So it gave me a great advantage over the regular Japanese, who is quite restricted in what they can view and who they can view the collection of. After I had been a student of Dr. Torigoye's for about 9 months, we had finished the translation of his book, and then we worked on several other small projects where he could explain to me various famous books and their contents. During this time, on weekends, I would go with Mrs. Torigoye to visit various collectors, and most of them were students of Dr. Torigoye, but there was usually one person to visit each weekend. So I got to know all the people who were there and see their collections. I probably saw at least 2,000 or 3,000 tsuba at that time. When we had finished the various translations and whatnot, Dr. Torigoye and I went to Tokyo together, which was going to be on the return, my return home. In Tokyo, we were able to visit a large number of collectors who also were friends and associates of Dr. Torigoye's. The most famous of all was a man called Hino, Hino. Hino Yutaro had been the last chief clerk of Amiya, which was a company owned by Ogura, who was the greatest authority in the Meiji period. He was my age at that time, 60 years ago, and a very nice gentleman. He was about 5 feet, maybe a little taller. He had a very tall head and very bushy eyebrows, and he looked exactly like Fukurokuju. At that time, in those days, if you were honored as an expert, you were shown 3 types of tsuba when you went to visit. One would be a kanaye, one would be a nobuye, and one would be a myoju. It didn't matter who you visited or where you visited. Those were the 3 tsuba they would always show you at the time, and then they would show you other pieces from their collection later. There were I was able to go to the National Museum in Tokyo in Ueno Park, where at that time all the great collections were kept in the museum basements for safety reasons. But they were kind enough to show me all the famous pieces that were kept in the museum. I think I spent a full day while they brought trays and trays and trays of tsuba for me to look at. There was only one little problem that I didn't know about at the time, why the man in charge of the museum was a man called Sato Kanzan, who wrote many, many box certificates. But he and Dr. Torigoye hated each other, which I didn't know at the time, and so they had to make conversation while I was watching and studying all these tsuba that were brought to me from the museum. But somehow why we managed to get through it. And then the same thing happened a second time. One of the great authorities, Nobuto Kawaguchi, had a small apartment in Tokyo, and he had been the last student of Akiyama Kyusaku before Dr. Torigoye, but they had never met. So he made arrangements, and we went to his house to visit and had a conversation, and he was an authority on the Goto school, so I asked questions about the Goto, and Dr. Torigoye translated for me. But what I didn't know was that they didn't like each other, and normally when you go to any collection or private exhibit, in Japan you take a gift to the person who you're visiting. But we had taken no gift for Mr. Kawaguchi. But after we had left his house, Dr. Torigoye went to the fruit market, which was near his house, and bought the biggest basket you could possibly find and had it sent to Mr. Kawaguchi as an insult. So it was an experience I had never had before, where they didn't like each other. But all these men, in fact everybody who I associated with at that time, has passed away now. I don't think any of them living. In fact, the last man who was still around was a man called Ogasawara, and he was in charge of the National Museum collection in the 1980s. And I just heard recently that he had passed away, so I think they're all gone now. When I returned to the United States, we had about 1 year, and then Fred Martin and I decided that we would try to have an exhibit of fittings, swords, and everything in one large exhibit. So for 4 years we worked on putting together what became the Barnesdale Park exhibit in Los Angeles. It's still the greatest exhibit that's ever been done outside of Japan. Unfortunately, in those days, 1964, when it was put on, there was no record kept of the exhibit. It wasn't photographed. Well, it was photographed, but it wasn't recorded. But it was a monstrous thing. It had a very small catalog because we had no money to pay for a decent catalog. But even today, it's remembered as the finest exhibit. Dr. Torigoye was not able to come to the opening of the exhibit, unfortunately. But most of the collectors from the West Coast were there. And that was about the end. I had Dr. Torigoye come to my house to stay for 2 weeks at one time. And there's something one should know. Normally in Japan, if an expert writes a certificate for you or writes something telling you that the object is good or authentic, they will be paid money for that. Dr. Torigoye never charged any money for his certificates. Naturally, if you wanted him to look at your collection, you would pay for his travel and time, but never for the certificate itself. They were all free. But he was about the only person who did that. In the 1960s and 70s, the people who would go for sword appraisals, the standard gift to give to the expert was a bottle of Johnny Walker Black whiskey, which you could get at the American Post Exchange for $3 at that time. But in Japan, they cost about $50 a bottle. So it was a very nice gift, and we would have a joke saying that this certificate is a $50 bottle or a $100 bottle or whatever it happened to be. But the organization that opened after the war, MacArthur was not interested in the sword and fitting problem, mainly the sword blades. He was too busy playing emperor, and so he had his assistant, a man called Colonel Cadwell, and it was Colonel Cadwell who was in charge of figuring out what to do with the swords after the war. They wanted to dump them all into Tokyo Bay. Luckily, that didn't happen. But Colonel Cadwell found Dr. Homa and Dr. Sato and made them the experts in fittings and in blades. And naturally, because of that, why they saved many, many very important pieces, which otherwise might have been destroyed. But the museums, naturally, were not in operation. Nothing was in operation. But eventually, what we refer to as the NBTHK, Nihon Bijutsu Token Hozon Kyokai, which they put the word bijutsu into this because they wanted to make the sword and fitting an art object. So it's the Japanese Art Sword Society. That way they could justify it, and they would put the society then under the Board of Education of Japan, and it became an extension of the Education Society, and still is part of the Education Society of Japan. Although now they're an independent, an independent corporation actually, who still do certificates, and the original men who were considered the finest experts are all passed away, so they're new young people by my standard who are in charge.